So 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 16, 18, 20. Everybody's here. Where's Molly? Hi, Molly. How are you? It's good to see you. How you feeling? Good. Good. Yeah. Take it easy. Rest yourself. Well, what were your thoughts on what I said last time, the beginning? This whole health and well-being shtick that I ran in front of you. Did it seem like a shtick? Does it seem like something that is important to you, or more broadly? Did it resonate at all, or were you kind of like, I just want to learn the parts, which is okay. It's what you signed up for, right? You wanted to learn how the parts work. What are your thoughts? Take your time. I'm patient. Yeah. Okay. Good. How pervasive is that message? Is it something you hear from other quarters, or was I a lone voice in the woods? Give me a sense of undergraduate education. I want to know what my colleagues are.
I've had teachers in the past that did at the beginning of the semester, and then one build up.
Yeah, good. Keep reminding me that I'm reminding you. Right? We'll just keep talking to each other about it. It's important. It's really important. What else?
I think it also depends. I've taken a psych course. We talk a lot about stress. The professor feels like it's part of if we're going to be learning about it, we should be mindful of it.
Yeah.
But like never in my biology.
Yeah.
Is that?
Yeah. It's a shame because biology is where it belongs. It belongs everywhere. Yeah.
So for a coach, that's like taking the time to actually exercise, point out the stress.
Yeah.
So at least not.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I teach a January class, Human Anatomy and Physiology. The anatomy is the lab part of it. And then I talk about the physiology in the lecture. And I like teaching that January class because I have them all to myself the whole month. And it's a lot easier to do bigger activities that relate to that. For example, I have this, I take them into the gym, and we do this metabolic analysis lab where they take a bunch of tests, in the morning, and then I take them into the gym, and they get to measure a bunch of vital statistics like their VO2 max, their ability of their body to carry oxygen, how much oxygen can their body carry per time, how their body responds to exercise in terms of their lung capacities. They calculate their basal metabolic rate, whatever. But there's other things, but it gives them a chance to see how their body responds both to stress and to exercise activity, and what kinds of activity are going to have, what are the different impacts of various types of activity. It's hard to do, though, just in a lecture. You have to be creative. I'm making you guys keep track of it on a daily basis, the stress. Hopefully that's instructive to everybody. All right. Well, any other thoughts before I dive in here? No? Okay. Let's fix the lights, shall we? Yeah. Enough light, right? All right. So last time I went over a little bit of the history of anatomy, physiology, the study of the human body, as a way to introduce the structure-function paradigm and how that's reflected in our concepts of anatomy and physiology. Well, now I want to look at the levels of organization in the body. Biology itself is, we call it a life science, and indeed it is, because it's the study of living organisms. But these living organisms that we study in biology are still subject to the profound laws of physics, the first principles in physics. And one of, I would say in my lifetime, one of the sort of evolutions in physics has been understanding the patterning of the material world, the patterning of systems that have an energy input into them, right? Another way to say that is the fractal nature of structure, of form. So, for example, a snowflake forms initially as a triangle, perhaps, and then there's triangles on the faces of the triangles, and there's triangles, smaller ones, on the faces of those edges, and so forth and so on, until you start going to this highly lengthened perimeter and in a finite surface area, in a finite area that the snowflake takes up. And there are patterns that you see at the macroscopic, and if you zoom in closely on the edge of the snowflake, you're going to see the same kinds of patterns down that size scale and up the size scale in a snowflake. And you ask, well, what's the energy input of a snowflake? And really, it's the process of freezing, right? There is a certain enthalpy to the formation of that ice crystal. In a very sort of general or abstract way, there are similar forces at work in living organisms. And if we look at a living organism, there are many layers of organization that we're going to see, and there's patterns to these different levels of organization that will have repeating motifs. Okay, and I'll point them out at different points throughout the semester. An obvious one is when we get to muscles. I like that to point it out there. I like to point it out in the nervous system. But kind of the grandest expression of this is just in appreciating the different, the hierarchy of organization in the whole organism. So, what is the most important aspect of a living being? Is it the whole organism, how everything fits together? Or is it how the different organ systems? Oh, geez. Hold on a second. Is it how the different organ systems? It's over here. Sorry. This morning, IT problem has kind of thrown me off my game. There we go. That's it. So is it the organism? The whole human body? Or is it the various organ systems that interact with one another? The cardiovascular system, the respiratory system, the urinary system. Or perhaps it's just cells. Perhaps cells are the fundamental unit of the living being. I don't know. I was a biochemist. That's what I was trained in. And so I tend to think of things on a more molecular level. And in fact, I was a carbohydrate chemist. 85% of what's alive on the planet is glucose, made of the glucose monomer. So I kind of think of most of what is as glucose. But glucose itself is just made of atoms, right? So the ways that atoms, it's really just chemistry, how it all fits together. There's these different levels of organization to the living being. This chart here just shows you the different ways we have of exploring these size scales, right? So the unaided human eye, remarkably, almost cosmically ironically, the smallest thing that can be probed with a good set of peepers is the human egg. A human egg, a human oocyte, is from a woman's ovary, is the smallest thing that that some good sight can pick up. That's pretty beautiful. Eggs are large cells, they're pretty big things. But compound light microscope can take us down much further than that. I talked about Hooke last time, Robert Hooke. And then the electron microscope, both the scanning and the transmission, can get us down remarkably small to where we can actually begin to visualize the atomic contours of biomolecules that are around us. I'll tell you a small ironic story related to that. I got to meet one of the very first physicians, scientists that ever got to use, he's a research, an ND PhD, that got to develop and use the scanning electron microscope. He's long dead now, but he's an interesting guy. I met him in a donut shop when I was in graduate school at University of Virginia. It's called Spud Nuts. They use potato flour. And the thing that is ironic and beautiful about this guy is he helped develop this technology that enables us to look into the most intimate yet remote corners of our own existence, right? But when I met him, he was fully blind in one eye and colorblind with like 2200 vision in the other, like legally blind in both eyes and colorblind in one. And he spent his time painting. His hobby was to paint. He would reproduce famous paintings like whatever, the Mona Lisa or whatever. But he would do it. He would get this like an eye magnifying glass, like a big thick one, and he'd get right down on the paper like this, and he would paint by tone, not by color, because he was colorblind. So he was never able to really get the whole picture stepped back from it because he couldn't see like that. He could only zoom in on a real narrow angle of it, and would produce these amazingly psychedelic paintings. Sweet 90-year-old man. The colors were all crazy and off, of course, but it was a pretty ironic reality for this guy. All right. So I'm going to assume that you have a basic foundation in chemistry, enough so that you can understand it's like I'm not going into any kind of deep chemistry in here. But if there's something you don't understand, you just wave your hand and I'll happily explain it. I am going to assume that you have a basic understanding of what proteins are and where they come from, how they're made, because I'm going to talk a lot about proteins. I talk a lot about the molecular mechanisms that underpin the physiology that makes our bodies work. And so I'll talk about proteins. I will talk a lot about cells, different types of cells. I'm going to introduce you to the various panoply of cells. I don't know, there's like 200 different cell types in the body. We're not going to talk about all of them, but we'll talk about a fair bit, given a semester's time together. These cells make up tissue. And there are 4 general categories of tissue. We'll talk about it in a bit, probably next week. But tissue is made up of a collection of different cell types. Tissue is not exclusively a collection of the same sort of cell, although it can be, rarely is. But it is tissues, various types of tissues, that come together and make an organ. For example, your heart is an organ. The heart itself, however, is not a system. It's part of a larger system, the cardiovascular system. And then the organism itself is made up of these interrelated but often independently functioning organ system. Yeah. So I have what, like 10 up there? Something like that. What do I have, 11? I have 11 of them. I usually say 12 because the reproductive system for the female and the male is different. Yeah, the bulk of what we spend our time together doing this semester is going to be talking about going through each of these organ systems, system by system, and talking about the physiology of them. And I'm going to start with the skeletal system because the skeletal system is a pretty easy one to talk about and introduce the concept of homeostasis, which is what today is going to be about, telling you what homeostasis is. I'm going to go through and just give you a brief flash through the organ systems, and then I'm going to spend the last half of the class today talking about homeostasis. And from there, I'm going to move on to tissue types as a way to introduce the integument, the skin, and then the next bit is going to be all about excitable tissues, the muscular system and the nervous system. And to do that, I'm going to have to set the stage by talking about a little bit of cell physiology, how the membranes in our cells are able to be kind of like little batteries. Each of them establishes a electrical potential, and in fact, an electrochemical potential across the membrane. So I'm going to describe that. That'll take us well past the midterm. And then the second half of the class, I'm going to spend time talking about perhaps a few of the more sophisticated systems or that require a deeper understanding to fully appreciate. I'm not going to get a chance to talk about the lymphatic system at all. So let's go through them. The integumentary system, the integument. The integument is beautiful. It really is. The largest organ system in the body. Composed of the skin, the hair, sweat glands, nails. Not only does it protect us from the outside world, but it helps us regulate our body temperature, and it gives us it's the primary way with which we react or interact with the world. It gives us all kinds of sensory information. In fact, the integument has a far higher density or absolute number of sensory receptors than any other organ system in the body. So the bulk of your peripheral nervous system terminates in the integument. All right. The skeletal system. Bones, of course. Shin bone connected to the thigh bone with some cartilage and ligament. But let us not forget the bone marrow. I'm not going to get to actually talk in depth about some of the more gross anatomy of the skeletal system. Most of the physiology I'm going to talk on related to the skeletal system involves the maintenance of calcium homeostasis. So, of course, the skeleton is going to provide protection for sensitive organs like the brain, the lungs, the heart, that kind of thing. It's going to provide rigid levers that the muscles can act on to help us move our body around. And I'm not going to talk about those things very much, in fact, at all, past this point. Mostly I'm going to talk about how it is the major repository for calcium in your body. It's extremely important. We'll talk about the importance of calcium in a bit. Other minerals as well, including phosphate, some other trace elements. And then the marrow is where is the principal site for erythropoiesis, red poiesis, blood cell growth. All right, so you make red blood cells in your bone marrow, your red bone marrow. The muscular system is made up of skeletal muscles and only skeletal muscles, not cardiac or smooth muscles, but only skeletal muscles, and the associated tendons, which are really just the connective tissue sheaths on the skeletal muscle cells. This is obviously how we move, but it does provide protection and support for other tissues. So I think maybe I've said it, maybe if I haven't, I grew up in Detroit. And after high school, I worked for a little while in the Majestic Theater. It is in downtown Detroit, and the Majestic Theater is home to Rock and Bowl, the oldest existing bowling alley in the country. But another claim to dubious fame is that this is the place where Harry Houdini sustained the fatal blow to the abdomen. Harry Houdini was, hopefully most of you recognize his name, he's a famous magician who had this running wager that he could take a punch to the gut from anybody. He had, I don't know, he must have had a pretty amazing, he was an amazing physical specimen, I guess. And someone tapped him on the shoulder in his dressing room, turned around when he wasn't paying attention and hadn't, gripped his muscles, took a blast to the gut, ruptured his spleen, died in Henry Ford Hospital in Detroit. But the point being here is that the abdominal muscles definitely protect your abdominal viscera, all right? And not just there, all over the place, muscles help to protect various sensitive structures. And then lastly, they are the source of your innate heat. Your muscles generate heat that keeps your body temperature elevated and happy. All right, nervous system, made up of the brain, the spinal cord, peripheral nerves, and the sense organs. There is, in some ways, you can kind of say that really all we as humans are these giant gray wriggling mass of neural worms that have these enormous life support suits called our bodies. Our brain, our nervous system, is the part of us that we are the most familiar with because it's the part of us that is familiar with things. It's what gives rise to our consciousness, our awareness. But there's a lot to the nervous system that is not just us, what we think of as us, our consciousness. It's going to receive information, gather information, sensory information from the outside world. It's going to interpret it. It's going to process it either consciously or subconsciously or unconsciously. All three of those things are different. And then it's going to have efferent output, motor output that will help to direct and coordinate the response of various effector organs in the body. So organs that are going to do something, right? Maybe door opens and a zombie werewolf senator from hell comes in the door. Whoa, I see it with my eyes. My nervous system says, this is a problem, and I jump through the window and run away. Okay, so that is all coordinated by my nervous system. All right. So that should be no surprise. The endocrine system. So if our nervous system is the electrical conduction system of the body, if it's the way that we transmit information along with electrical signals, then the endocrine system is the control system in the body that uses chemicals. Endocrine system is probably the most abstract and, I don't know, arguably the most interesting to me system. It's certainly a bit esoteric because it's this disparate collection of glands throughout the body. This disparate collection of glands that are made up of the pituitary which I guess you could describe as sort of the queen gland of the endocrine system. It sits atop all of the other organs in terms of the chemical hierarchy, the cascade of chemical signals that happens, the pituitary, also known as the hypophysis. We'll see where that is a little bit when we talk about the brain. And then there's a panoply of others, the thyroid, the pancreas, the suprarenal gland, formerly known as the adrenal gland, the gonads, which are the testes and ovaries, and there are endocrine tissues in lots of other systems. For example, the pancreas has endocrine function. Fat, adipocytes, your fat tissue has endocrine function to it. There's lots of other examples. So the function of the endocrine system is to direct long-term changes in the body. Long-term changes. So I see the werewolf, my body says, time to go, and I jump out the window. That's the brain, right? But going through puberty, for example, going from 10 years old to 13 years old, that's something that's a long-term change that's mediated by the endocrine system. Chemical signaling also tends to target a wide array of tissues because it's chemical that those hormones are circulating through the body and can hit a lot of targets. Cardiovascular system. Now, I like to think of the cardiovascular system simply as the chemical logistics of the body, the chemical logistics system. It's it's made of the heart, blood, and blood vessels, and it's how we deliver things around the body. So it's going to distribute blood cells, which are carrying the blood gases, oxygen, carbon dioxide. Obviously, it's important in terms of water balance in the body, carries various dissolved materials like nutrients, waste products, hormones, etc. All that is obvious, but more than that, it's also important in distributing heat throughout the body. Now, water has, what's special about water? What is special about water? There's a lot of special things about it. Yeah, exactly. Thank you very much from a chemistry major. That's right. It has a high heat capacity. And in fact, it has a high heat capacity because it has such a high potential for forming hydrogen bonds, right? And those hydrogen bonds are a great way to store energy, thermal energy. So all that water that's in the blood is a huge heat sink. It's an amazing heat sink. And your body can regulate where that heat is localized, right? Maybe you are outside, like if I was just 5 feet that way right now, all my peripheral capillaries would constrict and I would localize blood to the core, maintaining heat to the more important parts of me and letting my fingers and toes and other bits freeze off. Or maybe I was a couple kilometers down the road at Quarry Road skiing, like I'm hoping to do this afternoon, and I would be generating lots of heat, so much heat that I'm going to want to let some of that heat go. So I'm going to have dilation, vasodilation, so that blood can go to the periphery and then radiate off the body, right? So it regulates body temperature. It's one of the main ways we regulate body temperature. The lymphatic system. So you can talk to Dr. Hannum about this. I studied immunology. I got my master's degree in immunology before moving on to other things. But so the lymphatic system is interesting. She's our resident immunologist. Made up of the spleen, thymus, lymphatic vessels, the lymph nodes, and the tonsils, which are really just specialized lymph nodes. Lymphatic system is fascinating. It really is. It's such a fascinating topic to study. I sadly am maybe, because I have a tendency to go on tangents, maybe I'll talk about it a little bit I have some fun stories to share with it, but I have no formal plan to talk about the lymphatic system. What does it do? It helps us defend against the bad guys. This is our defense system. Defends against infection, disease of different types. So there could be pathogens, things that come in from outside, or maybe cancer. I forget what the statistic is. It's something like your body generates over 1 million potentially cancerous cells a day or whatever that your immune system is recognizing and eliminating. Pretty important job for the lymphatic system. And it returns tissue fluids to the bloodstream. It also, I don't have this on this list, I should. The lymphatic system is how we absorb fats through the gut, through the GI system. So proteins and carbohydrates come directly into the bloodstream, but fats that we absorb have to actually pass through the lymphatic system and enter through what's called the thoracic duct. You see that big green tube that looks like it's sneaking down behind the heart there? That's the thoracic duct. Not quack quack, duct with a T. All right, respiratory system. Nasal cavity, sinus, larynx, trachea, bronchi, lungs, and alveoli. What a fun word. Alveoli sounds like an Italian delicious dish or something. What does it do? Well, of course, it's going to deliver air to the respiratory surfaces of the lungs. This is where gas exchange happens. And this is how we oxygenate the blood. It's also how we blow off our carbon dioxide that we find in the blood. Not unimportantly, this is how we communicate. Phonation, the generation of sound happens at the larynx. This is how we communicate. I don't have it on the list as well, but the lungs are also the site of some endocrine function as well, which we'll talk about. If you didn't get it all, the slides are all up. You can get it there. The GI tract, the digestive system, teeth, tongue, pharynx, esophagus, stomach, small intestine, large intestine, liver, gallbladder, and pancreas. So this is going to process your food, digest your food, you chew it up, break it down into the smaller nutrient pool, and then helps to absorb those. The liver is how we store a lot of this energy, these nutrients, specifically the carbohydrates, the glucose that I talked up so much earlier, in the form of glycogen, which is essentially animal starch. The liver is also the only organ in the body that can absorb fructose. So for any of you guys who like to drink soda pop with the high fructose corn syrup, it's going straight to your liver, just so you know where it's at. All right. Urinary system. Compact but effective, important system. Kidneys, ureters, urinary bladder, and urethra. We excrete waste products from the blood, helps control water balance and blood pressure, and controls the pH and osmolarity of your blood. All right. The bladder, of course, stores urine prior to elimination. That's a function of the bladder. So the urinary system. We'll talk about quite a bit of the homeostatic regulation of blood pressure in the urinary system chapter when I get there late in the semester. Male and female reproductive systems. I'm not going to talk about these at all. I'm not going to talk about them at all. Unfortunately, I wish I had more time to. It's both the male and female reproductive systems are probably the most humbling in some aspects of the organ systems in the body. It's pretty incredible that the male reproductive system is able to produce an independently motile cell, you might call it an organism, that is able to leave the body, and then even more miraculously, the female reproductive system can receive that and have that cell fertilize an oocyte and then become the site for implantation of an embryo that will grow into a fetus, and after 9 months become a baby that emerges into this world. Have any of you ever witnessed this? Has any of you seen the birth of a child? Some special thing right there. Some special thing. Yeah. We had home births, and I got to see both of my kids, and that was the highlight of my life. It's incredible. And then the female reproductive system doesn't stop there. The uterus, you'd think that would be enough. The uterus, which is this incredible organ that changes so radically in such a short period of time and is able to support the life of another organism, another human. Once the postpartum, once the birth happens, the mammary glands are able to produce this incredible stuff, milk. We will talk about milk a little bit just because I'm a carbohydrate chemist. I talk about babies as much as I can here because it's pretty interesting, the biology of it all. So, but no formal chapter on either of them. All right. I kind of went long in the tooth again. I'll let you out on time, though, I promise. All right, right here. The homeostasis is the fundamental principle of physiology. I can't say it better than it's typed on the page up there. It's the fundamental principle of all physiology. And what is it? It's the process by which all the body systems are working interdependently to maintain a stable internal environment. All right, I have a picture of this clown or an acrobat, whatever he is there, standing on a ball, because I think it aptly describes the process of homeostasis. This guy looks so steadfast on his ball, doesn't he? As if he's just casually standing there, as if there was nowhere else in the room to stand. But in fact, he is, anyone who's ever stood and done yoga or stood anywhere, done acrobatics, or just stood and thought about what that even means, notices that there's this line, this sort of cord running down the middle of your body, and you're constantly negotiating that in small corrections. My body's going this way, bring it back, this kind of thing. And maybe you're so good at it that you can't even tell the fluctuations, but they're there. And indeed, that's what the guy in the ball is doing. It's tiny fluctuations around an ideal point, whatever that ideal is. All right. So the idea was first advanced by this guy Walter Cannon in the first part of the 20th century. The phrase I have here is dynamic equilibrium around within a limited range around a fixed set point. All right. So the process, there's two types. There's negative and positive feedback. We'll talk about them. I'm probably not going to get to all of them today, but negative feedback is going to keep that variable close to a set point. If we deviate too far from that set point, toten, we're done. Death ensues. Death, illness or death. Homeostasis, important concept. So what are the parts of a homeostatic system? Well, there's some kind of regulated variable. There's whatever it is that we're going to control, right? Maybe it's body temperature. Maybe it's ambient calcium levels in the serum. There's all kinds of different variables that you can imagine in the body. Then there's a set point. A set point is the ideal. This is the ideal, that where we would like that variable to be. All right? Effectors are structures or systems that can effect the variable. They can change the value of that variable. So here we have a regulated variable. There needs to be some kind of sensor, a sensor that is going to be able to monitor that regulated variable. That sensor is going to send information to some sort of integration center. Where that is highly variable. We'll talk about that in a bit. This integration center is going to compare this incoming value from the sensor to its inherent set point, what it thinks the ideal is. Then, depending upon the results of that comparison, it's going to send the appropriate signal out to the effector. So here's a little bit of vocab for you when you take the GRE or whatever. An effect is something that you are causing in the world. It's something that's flowing out of you. An affect is something that happens to you. You get affected by something, but you cause an effect in something. Does that make sense? And we'll return to that in a bit. So this integration center is effecting something. It's coming out of it, and it's either whatever this comparison was. It's either going to increase or decrease the regulated variable, so it comes closer to this ideal set point. All right. Feed-forward controller. A feed-forward controller is not in every homeostatic system, but it's simply some stimulus that is outside of the homeostatic system that is able to affect the same cycle. So, for example, the one I have here is the normal anticipatory regulation of heartbeat in advance of actual physical exertion. So when you're on the starting block, you haven't started running yet, but your heartbeat elevates. Your heartbeat elevates. Not because there's increased demand for oxygen in your body yet, but because the brain, it knows something's going to happen, so it begins to send a signal down to the heart in anticipation, in a feed-forward control, in anticipation of the exertion, in anticipation of the need. All right. So here are a couple other semantic distinctions. Homeostatic systems can either have intrinsic or auto-regulation or extrinsic. So intrinsic regulation means that you have some kind of cell or tissue that acts as its own sensor to some variable, and it causes a change that affects its own activity. It's within a single cell. That's what they call it intrinsic regulation, because it doesn't involve a lot of travel or distances or multiple cell types or anything of the sort. It's a cell that entirely encapsulates the homeostatic loop. Extrinsic is going to involve the nervous system or the endocrine system. I shouldn't have and. It could be and or. The nervous and endocrine system. So a signal comes up, and the nervous system is going to mediate that. Really, it's just a distinction of whether the effector and the integration center are the same, which is in intrinsic regulation, or different places, which is in extrinsic. Does that make sense? This is all pretty straightforward so far. All right. So this is probably the last concept I go through here. The role of negative feedback. So in this classroom, the thermostat's over there. And how does this work? Well, you set the temperature in there, and there's a bunch of little hamsters on wheels. We can hear them in the walls here, running on their cages, heating the room up. There's a sensor in here. There's a little thermistor that is sensitive to the temperature. If the temperature is, for example, below the set point, if it gets below the set point, that's in centigrade there, if it gets below the set point, then the hamsters come on and it starts to heat up the room. And so we have this set point, and with time, the actual temperature in the room kind of fluctuates up and down, up and down. So heater turns on here, heats up the room, gets to the top of this range, kicks off, and drops again until it gets too low and it kicks back on, right? This is the way a thermostat works. This is more or less precisely how it works in the body. That clock is a little bit fast. I know there's doors banging and stuff, but everything here tells me I've got a few minutes left. So I want to finish this concept. In the body, we have temperature receptors, thermoreceptors in our skin, right? That tell us what's going on with the temperature in our body. And maybe we get, so this is heat here, maybe we get too hot, all right? Maybe we're overheating. And the signal comes into the thermoregulatory center of the brain, the part of the brain that is monitoring our temperature. It says, oops, too warm, and it sends a signal out to various places in the body. So if the comparison to the set point is, wow, we're above, then it's going to send a signal to the sweat glands in the skin. It's going to make the blood vessels dilate so we can radiate off some of the heat from the blood, like I talked about earlier, bringing us back to normal. All right, so that's negative feedback. Now here's another example of this. Has anybody hopped out of bed too quickly sometimes? What happens? What happens? When you get dizzy, don't you? Your vision can go gray, right? When you get out of bed, the blood drains from your head. The blood drains from your head, and that drops the blood pressure to the brain rapidly. There are what are called Barrow receptors, pressure receptors, basically stretch receptors, in what's called your carotid bulb. It's the bifurcation of the common carotid to the internal and external. That's right about here. Right? These baroreceptors that are built there and in the aortic arch as well. They monitor this blood pressure, and as soon as they feel a drop, they send a signal up to the Cardiovascular System in the brainstem, which sends signal down via the vagus nerve, we'll talk about that later, and speeds up the heart and pushes your blood pressure up. If you get up too fast, that system can't quite keep up with it. As people get older, they get atherosclerosis, hardening of the arteries. And so in elderly people, the ability of those stretch receptors to detect postural changes in blood pressure is impaired because the blood vessels have lost their elasticity. And because of that, a lot of older people, when they get up, even if they get up kind of slowly, they are super wobbly. They're super wobbly. First thing in the morning is by far the highest incidence of elderly people falling, cracking their hips, otherwise hurting themselves because of this problem right here. Negative feedback, postural change in blood pressure. So that seems like that's it. 9:50 on my watch here. Thank you very much. Next time we'll talk about positive feedback and we'll dive right into calcium homeostasis. Any questions? Comments? I'm sorry I started a little late today. I didn't have the cord I needed. Have a great day. Nice weekend. Maybe I'll see you out there on the ski slopes. Who likes to cross-country ski? Any of you? No one?